Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope everyone is doing well. Thank you for joining us for this seminar where we will be engaging with a paper by Maya Bhardwaj, who is a queer community organizer, activist, musician, artist, facilitator, and scholar, currently based at the University of Pretoria. And their current work focuses on South Asian diaspora and Indian South African leftist activisms, queerness, and the possibilities of Black and South Asian solidarities. And I think we'll be hearing about some of these research focuses in the paper that will be presented today. Very interesting themes, I think, that will come out of this. And I think it will encourage very rich discussion from everyone. So Maya will be presenting their paper titled, It Might Not Always Be What I Led With, but It's Always There, Queer, Diasporic, South Asian Identities and Politics in Black, Brown, and Multiracial Activisms. So please, Maya, if you could take it away. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Looks like we have a little bit more of an intimate session, which I think is wonderful because hopefully that means that there's more time for us to engage with each other, particularly since some of the themes we're going to be talking about are intimacies in political comradeship and activism. So thank you, Chris, for the introduction. I won't repeat what you just said. But I will be talking a little bit more about my positionality in the work later on, so I'll come to that. I want to tell you all a little bit of an anecdote with regards to the title of this presentation and this paper in formation. So as Chris mentioned, I have worked as a community organizer for about the past 10 years. And more recently, I've transitioned into the research side of this work for reasons I'll explain. And in the midst of just like a friendly conversation over drinks with a new friend and interlocutor and comrade here in South Africa in Johannesburg, she was sharing with me some of the spaces, particularly anti-capitalist organizing spaces and mutual aid spaces that she had been involved with for the past few years. And she had told me prior that she identified as queer. But when I asked her about how queerness shows up in those spaces for her and more broadly, if at all, she told me that it, meaning queerness, may not be what I lead with, but it's always there. And so we went on to talk about how for both of us, actually, in our shared experiences, our queernesses were present in the organizing spaces and the activist spaces that we came into, but they may not have been the focal point of what drew us into the space or the focal point of the space itself. And so this paper as a whole seeks to make an intervention into the understanding of queer politics and to trouble the sort of siloing of queer politics into one particular part of struggle, and instead to open up methods of understanding the way that queerness undergirds numerous spaces, particularly through the vantage point of queer South Asian, diasporic, and Indian South African activists and organizers. And this image on the other side is something that I made with comrades for a zine on queer activism and care. And some of these are images from my field work or from other interactions with comrades and loved ones. And some images are from media or other representations of queer South Asian politics. And all the quotes are from the field work. Okay, so I've started to talk a little bit about this in general. We talked already about the siloing of queer politics, the assumption that queer people de facto organize in queer spaces, and they're primarily organizing a sort of around a rights-based approach of recognition and equal citizenship or equal participation for queer people. That, of course, is true. But part of the research problem that I present is that there's multiple other ways that queer politics functions, and there's need for more research on that. Secondly, while there is in all the three countries where I conduct my research, so that's South Africa, as well as the US, where I'm originally from, and also the UK, both sites or all sites for their large and politicized South Asian or Indian diasporas, and politicized on sort of both sides of the political arena, that you have both a strong history of leftism in some countries, though it may be occluded in some spaces more than in others, but at the same time we have a rise or perhaps a ongoing presence of right-wing politics, whether in alliance with white supremacy or with Hindu nationalism or other forms of fascism. So the second kind of core research problem that brought me to this work is the need for a better understanding of how queerness shows up within the politics and the activism of Indian and South Asian diasporic individuals and movement spaces. There's a wealth of research, both academic as well as artistic, cultural, kind of journalistic, on the activism of Indian South African people and South Asian British people. And there's an emerging field of literature on the politics of South Asian Americans. So that is, to be frank, a bit more recent. However, there's very little analysis of how queerness shows up in those spaces, whether around queer politics, specifically in the traditional sense that I'm interrogating, or just with regards to the queerness of people who may have been present in those movements, but as our first interlocutor said, they didn't lead with that identity. So that's the second kind of major research problem that I'm exploring. And then finally, I'm interested in the way that queerness shifts the way that South Asian and Indian folks practice solidarity and engage in politically Black or Black and brown or multiracial or perhaps non-racial spaces, and the way that they lean into building relationships, intimacy, kinships, and more generative politics rather than a politics of dismantling when engaging across cultural or racial lines. And so this hopes to fill a gap between a number of fields of research, including area studies, traditional social movement studies, cultural studies, and more. I think I've said this already, so I'm going to skip this slide actually now that I'm noting time. So in terms of the temporal kind of theme for this research that I'm undertaking, I think particularly relevant to the themes that the history workshop explores, my work has been primarily contemporaneous. I've spent the majority of my time with activists who identify as Indian or South Asian, identify as being linked to diaspora or linked to the three kind of sites of research country-wise that I mentioned, and consider themselves to be queer in some ways or to be interested in the way that queerness shows up in political spaces. So in terms of the contemporaneous political setting, I think things like COVID and the increase of precarity, like the rise of the Hindu right and Islamophobia, the kind of continuation of caste violence and caste apartheid, both in the subcontinent as well as in the diaspora, uprisings against state violence and for the sanctity of Black lives, and a variety of other kind of moments of precarity, crisis, and violence are the frame on which this study has unfolded upon in each of these three settings. I think most of the interlocutors that I've been engaging with are thinking about the sort of unraveling of late stage capitalism and the way in which that work is incredibly racialized and also is intersectional along lines of gender, sexuality, etc., and are combating in many cases trauma from isolation, not only due to lockdowns, but due to wider political forces. In terms of my own relationship to this work, and the sort of clock of the world in terms of Grace Lee Boggs's analysis of the political climates that we're in. I, as I mentioned, have been an organizer and kind of a social movement worker for 10 years as my primary work, and for about 15 years in general. So I'm newer to academia, and I came to this space due to a number of deep questions that I had been asking with comrades and peers around the ways that we do activism, the ways that solidarity politics and racial politics play out in different spaces in diaspora, and the way that South Asians and Indians particularly show up in diasporic spaces or outside of the subcontinent, and how queerness manifests in each of these spaces. So this is a photo from a direct action that comrades and loved ones of mine and I did in 2016 in New York, shutting down the ICE processing facility. And even within that action, questions of race and class and queerness arose significantly, both in the preparation as well as in the moment of the action and the aftermath. So I think that's one sort of like microcosm of the way that I've been thinking about this work, primarily through multiracial or non-racial spaces. So this paper draws from the overarching research that I'm doing for my PhD at the University of Pretoria, and that's also been supported by the history workshop. So these methodologies speak to my overarching research, but also specifically to this paper in formation. I have been embedded within the social movement spaces that I study. So I am in those spaces as both a researcher, but also as a peer, as a comrade, as an activist myself. And then I have conducted one-on-one and in some case group interviews with folks who are present in those spaces, about 25 per country, as well as grounding my work in some archival documentation and exploration of the development of South Asian and Indian politics in each of these three countries. Just as a note, again, sort of correlating with this intervention around what queer politics mean, I want to lift up that the interlocutors who I'll be quoting and sharing thoughts from today are present across a variety of sort of issues or categories of struggle against racial capitalism and cis heteropatriarchy. So some folks are particularly organizing around anti-racist or non-racial or racial justice movements. Some folks are specifically in queer or trans justice spaces, but others are entering into spaces that are primarily feminist, that are perhaps caste abolitionist or police and prison abolitionist, that are organizing against deportation in the hostile environment and thinking about the abolition of borders. Some folks are active around climate and environmental justice, economic dignity issues like worker justice, housing, trade unionism. And many folks are active in multiple spaces, which is also true for myself. So I think recognizing the interconnection and the intersectionalities of the ways that people conceptualize both their own political identities and therefore the struggles that they enter into is one of the key kind of takeaways that I think is coming out of this research, and is of course not unique to queer South Asians or queer Indian South Africans, but really has not been fully explored yet with regards to those particular set of interlocutors. So I think within any study that engages with these type of topics, there are a number of sticky conceptual terms that are not particularly well bounded and that often are like very contentious themselves. Because of time, I'm not going to go into the debates on each of these terms, but I do want to recognize that terms like Indianness or South Asianness are extremely contested. Terms like Blackness are incredibly contested and show up in different ways across the three different sites of research. Diaspora in and of itself is a complicated term, particularly for folks who may identify as being members of different generations with regards to migration history. And of course, one of the key things that I'm interrogating is solidarity, activism, organizing in social movements, and how that interacts with queerness. But just going to note that, but not kind of go into those debates here. I am also going to go pretty quickly through this slide for the interest of time, but I think there are four major themes that are coming up, both in the sort of theoretical underpinnings for this work and the work of other scholars who I build upon, as well as the themes that are coming out of the field work that I've been conducting. So one of the core themes is the way that racialization functions for Indian and South Asian folks in diaspora. So there's literature that explores how this develops in different ways in each three countries, and to a lesser extent, but yes, to some degree, explores a direct juxtaposition of racialization for South Asian and Indian folks across these countries. And I think this is particularly relevant when we're thinking about the political work of South Asians and Indian South Africans, particularly on the left, because there is markedly access to proximity to whiteness for some categories of South Asian and Indian folks. That may be through capital, that may be through the legacy of colonial and apartheid structures that created a sort of sandwich, as one of my interlocutors talks about it. But in some ways, there is what one could examine as perhaps a choice for certain South Asian and Indian South African folks. Of course, that's not the case for all, but a choice whether to opt in to radical politics, or in some cases, whether to align with white supremacy and with Hindu fascism, Islamophobia, etc. So I'm particularly curious about what causes people to opt into radical politics, to opt into leftism, and to opt also into solidarity with other racialized communities. So that's one of the things that comes up and is emerging in different ways across each of the three sites, but also with a number of shared experiences. Queerness, both as an identity, like for people who are LGBT, who they love, who they spend time with, as well as queerness as a politic, as an alternate way of practicing activism, practicing social movements, is a large part of the research and the theoretics that I'm exploring. So I think it's important to interrogate that queerness does not necessarily correlate with leftism or correlate with radicalism. And I think there's a great degree both of political struggle as well as scholarship that's interrogating the ways that queerness has been and is perhaps in increasing degrees incorporated into the state, into regimes of violence. For example, Poir's work on homonationalism, Rao's work on homocapitalism, Upadhyay's work on the homonationalism of Hindutva and the Hindu fascist state. And these are dynamics that are coming up in the organizing spaces that I'm a part of, where we see in some cases queer South Asian folks who embrace their queerness as an identity, but embrace a very conservative and in some cases quite violent politics with regards to the way that their queerness shows up. At the same time, we have interventions from Dalit feminists, Black feminists, working class feminists, and other kind of queer folks whose intersectional approaches to their politics argues very firmly for a queerness of resistance. And I think I'm exploring how folks are emulating that or troubling that within South Asian and Indian diasporas. And amidst these kind of troublings and these explorations comes up the core kind of framework of solidarity. And I think solidarity shows up both within diasporic communities, like both within South African Indian or Indian South African struggles, within South Asian British or South Asian American struggles, as well as between South Asians and other racialized groups. I'm not particularly looking at the way that South Asians are engaging with white politics, even on the left, though people may also be present in spaces that include white folks. But some of the key concepts that people are interrogating are this sort of colonial or apartheid sandwich and the mythology of the model minority, and instead the sort of histories of South Asian and Indian radicalism, leftism, and principled struggle. And finally, as I mentioned, thinking through what Blackness means is really core to the way that many of these folks are interpreting both their politics and their praxis of solidarity. Some folks identify themselves as Black in a Biko sense or in a political sense, whereas some folks are very firm on their identities as not Black, but in allyship with Blackness. So that's been some of the things that I've been interrogating with interlocutors, particularly with regards to how that comes up and how they relate to struggles around the contesting meanings and state responses to Blackness. So we're having conversations about what does it mean to be in joint struggle, to be in co-conspiratorship to be in co-conspiratorship versus what is the model that allyship provides, and how is that different? And here I'm drawing from the work of scholars like Robin D.G. Kelly, as well as sort of contrasting explorations of Afro-pessimism and the notion of the difficulty of solidarity between Black folks, not in a political sense, but in an Afro-pessimist sense, and South Asians or other racialized communities. Okay. So I think one of the quotes that I really want to lift up for you all is the way that some of my interlocutors are both struggling with and also coming to new ways of connecting or suturing queer to diaspora in the way that Gopinath writes about back in 2005. So Tara, who is a cis queer Indian American femme, talks about the way that she felt that her Indian identity and her political identity were separated for a long time, but now she's coming back to recognizing that the way she practices her politics, the way that she lives out her queerness is Indian and shows up in these organizing spaces that she's a part of, which are, in her case, primarily Black spaces. And I think this note of, I exist because my ancestors have the audacity to exist, because we were queer before we were colonized, is something that really resonates across the interviews that I've been doing with folks and the kind of group participant research. So I think another kind of core theme that I'd like to lift up is that there is demonstrably wide activism in a disproportionate way by folks who identify as queer and also as Indian South African or as South Asian in the diaspora. And what I mean by disproportionate is that compared to the wider community of South Asians or Indians in diaspora, there are more queer folks involved in leftist political struggle. I'm just gonna take like 2 more minutes if that's okay. So, of course, some elements of this are questioning whether struggle as a whole, whether leftist politics as a whole lends itself to the participation of queer folks, but that's also something that folks are troubling with regards to the way that queerness is often occluded or explicitly excluded within kind of traditional leftist social movements. The second large theme is that there are really high examples of shared experience and shared praxis, even with this context of divergent histories of racialization and movement building in each country. And then this theme around building within as well as building across, and this way that people are thinking about struggle is something that's coming up a lot, particularly orienting around queered modes of doing solidarity that are emphasizing things like relationship building and queer intimacies and kinship. So this quote from Har, I think, underlines the piece about this over-representation that folks are recognizing, and that folks are recognizing it both for those who are out or for those who are not vocal, in the way that Aisha from South Africa says. Oops, I went the wrong way. And I want to spend a little bit more time on this slide, because Hard, as well as others, including Willow, who talks about her practice as queering everything, or Nick, who talks about mask versus femme organizing and organizing because of wanting to feel love. Hard's words, and this is actually an image from a direct action that one group that I organized with in the UK carried out this past year. This is not Hard. This is another interlocutor, but I found that these words really resonated with the themes of this action, which were connecting sort of pinkwashing and homo-nationalism, homo-capitalism, and rejecting that with an insistence on both border and prison abolition. And so Hart talks about this as a politics of conceiving or creating, of a politics of visioning and dreaming a new world, as opposed to what she describes as patriarchal or paternalistic organizing that approaches the world in a form of war making, that instead orienting around these sort of queer politics across spaces opens up space to recognize and to envision another world that is possible. So I think the core intervention that folks are making is that queerness changes the way that these spaces function, whether folks are speaking explicitly about their queerness or not, but that it's yielding different practices of solidarity building and different practices of thinking about like the end goals of activism and organizing in a way that both reframes racialization and reframes the sort of tactical alliances that many of my interlocutors interrogate. And that also reframes like what queerness and what queer politics means in general. I think like we're pretty close to time. There's a lot more quotes here. So I'll just kind of like leave some of them up for you all to get a sense of. But in relation to the way that folks are thinking about dismantling what their racialization means, dismantling a relationship to whiteness, and instead leaning into this sort of relationship building with people that have been marginalized, with people that are thinking about remaking the world is something that's really coming out through this research, and I'm excited to talk about with you all. So we'll end here. These are some images from like anecdotes that I'm writing about in the paper that's forming, and yeah, really looking forward to hearing you all's thoughts. Here are some of the key references. Thank you. I'm gonna stop this share.
Thanks so much, Maya. That was a really interesting presentation. And I'm going to open it up to the audience now for any questions or comments. Okay, so we have one from Noor. If you could please go ahead, Noor.
Great, thanks, Chris, and thanks very much, Maya. That was really very interesting for a number of reasons, including the emphasis on activism and the sort of engagement with various theories and concepts. And I kind of preface my questions with that comment because my sense is that sometimes, scholars who kind of engage on questions of identity, and that's not your only focus, but it's one dimension of your focus, themselves are satisfied with the performative dimension of that, and are not really involved in activism. So they speak the language, but they have no real connection to actual experiences and actual struggles. And in my mind, renders their work quite shallow. This is quite different. So I've got two or three kind of broad questions. And I realize that, you have a lot of experience, you've done quite a lot of thinking and writing around this, but you also, from a formal academic position, you just sort of, out of the starting blocks. So the first question is about, what your thoughts are about where queer studies is at the moment, right? I mean, this has been a growing area over a long time, and I think it's fascinating and has influenced other areas of academic political research in really productive ways, and has, challenged conventional thinking. But I wonder if what your sense is about where queer studies is and where the interesting kind of work is located. Linked to that, is the inevitable question, which I'm sure you're sick and tired of, but I'm going to ask it anyway. In your kind of matrix of intersecting ideas and theories and the like, one of the salient threads that stand out is the articulation between what in the kind of scholarship and politics is called identity politics and class struggle. I don't want to presume, any kind of, position that you might have, but I wonder where you stand on that, because it's an ongoing debate. And my real question is where that debate is in the three contexts in which you are doing research. because there's some overlap, at least, what I'm aware of in the way that debate is evolving in South Africa and the United States. But I wonder whether that applies in all three sides. So it's less about the debate itself, but about where the debate stands in those different contexts and how those different moments in the debate are shaping or potentially shaping, both your research and what you and what you're thinking. And then the final, kind of question is about social movements, because you speak about your own involvement in what you call social movements, and I think that's the appropriate term to use. But I don't see in the kind of various concepts that you have given us, and I may have missed it if I have just dismissed my question, theorization of social movements in and of themselves. And I wonder if that is the case, why that is the case, and how you're thinking about that, in addition to the various other very interesting, theories that you engage in. Thanks.
Right. Thanks, Noah. So we'll take the next two questions by Stefan first, and then Kasonde, and then we'll allow Maya to answer.
Thanks, Maya. It's a great presentation. I'm very interested in where you go with your findings. I'm also an American, and I guess that's a complicated term with these multi-layered identities, but in South Africa at the moment. My question has to do with this, these challenges about thinking transnationally and comparatively, and foregrounding solidarity, but then also perhaps making quick comparisons that can neglect attending to full historic contexts and differences. I think one of the recent publications that perhaps misses the mark on this is Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, right? I really enjoyed reading The Warmth of Other Suns about the Great Migration, but then I found that book, in trying to do the work of solidarity and comparing the Black experience and the caste system, right, there were a lot of conceptual slippages and simplifications. And so I guess my question to you would be, how are you thinking about the distinctive nature of various diasporic experiences while also, thinking about solidarity and the ways to link struggles?
Thank you, Stefan. Let's have Kasonde next.
Thanks so much, Maya. A very interesting presentation. I have a question and a comment, and I'm still processing my thoughts, so maybe I'll come back later. But to start with, I just want you to say a little more about, you said some of one of the concepts coming out of your interviews with your interlocutors is them seeing their activism as a form of decolonization. And correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, I find that very, very, very fascinating for a number of reasons. And maybe this is the question comment. What are the connections? I know you're looking at diasporic identity, but what are the connections to home? Because I know India recently, well, about 4 or 5 years ago, I think, decriminalized consensual adult same-sex activity. So are there any connections to what's happening at home and the identities at home and in the diaspora? What are the connections that you're seeing? And yeah, just say a little more about decolonial and decolonization. I see you use a border theory in your conceptual framework. But yeah, I'm still processing other questions, but I think for now, that's the question I have.
Thanks, Kasonde. And now I'll hand it over to Maya to answer those.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for these really great and thoughtful questions. I think it's really interesting to hear some of the questions being particularly around the academic debates and the scholarly questions, and some of the questions being about the praxis of organizing and the praxis of activism and social movements in these spaces. And I think that's really beautiful here, because I think that's sort of like the fine balance that this work that I'm attempting to do is attempting to find. So I am, what order do I want to go in? I'll start with Kasondi's question, because I think it also interacts with Noor's question about identity politics and class struggle, though there are also some distinctions. So yeah, I think I didn't articulate decolonization within this paper as like the key or one of the key themes, though it certainly is something that's coming up for people. I think honestly, the way that folks are more likely to articulate it is like an organizing that targets white supremacy and that targets capitalism. So like a dismantling of racial capitalism. Though, of course, some folks are explicitly talking about decolonization. And I think particularly for activists who are politicized through moments or movements like Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall, decolonization is something that's like a really salient part of their political histories and formations. So with regards to that, like I think the question of home is a really big one. And I think for many of these folks, there's a sense in some cases of like a lack of home or a sense of exile, and that's exile both from like the imagined home country that like doesn't really exist for most people, like especially for folks who have been based in whatever country they're active in for many generations. The idea of like some imagined homeland is much less defined, right? They're much more rooted in the countries where they're active. And I'm actually not talking to anyone who identifies as a recent migrant and identifies more in connection to the place where they migrated from, because I'm interested in how folks are considering home to be in diaspora, and in that way building off of the research of folks like Anne-Marie Fortier or Gayatri Gopinath, who talk about these constructions of diasporic home for South Asians, and also more broadly in a way that centers queer relationship building. But I think the concept of home is also particularly difficult right now, in a context where, you know, you mentioned the repeal of Article 377 in India, but at the same time, we have the passage or the attempt to pass extremely homophobic, queerphobic, anti-Dalit and casteist laws across India, as well as in other places of the subcontinent. And so in many cases, folks are examining a kind of lack of any imagined home that aligns with their politics, and instead are really rooting in their sense of home in the countries where they're located. And I think are often exploring their relationships to multiracial or non-racial solidarity work, and particularly their relationship to Black struggle, to Indigenous struggle, to other racialized struggle as a praxis of creating and engaging in home in diaspora. So I think like that's definitely a really big thing, and is conceptually as well as praxis-wise something that's very interesting to track, because many folks talk about the feeling of like losing home both within diasporic community because of queerness, whether they have come out or not, as well as losing or not ever having that connection to like an imagined homeland that is prevalent within like more traditional diasporic studies because of these political questions. So I don't know if that's like an answer, but I think it's like something that's coming up a lot and is really affecting the praxis of how folks do politics. Like some folks are involved in organizing spaces that are explicitly oriented towards kind of speaking out against things happening in the subcontinent. So they're pretty explicitly engaging with the idea of home and belonging. So for example, the sort of solidarity actions that came up against the CAA and NRC, and were in many cases led by queer and Muslim South Asian folks across the diaspora. But in other cases, folks are very much firm about home being where they're rooted, and that's why their praxis of building solidarity and building struggle is rooted in relationship to other racialized communities. So yeah, it shows up in different ways, and it's very interesting. I think that kind of leads me into the question about like transnationality that's Stefan, I think, or Stefan raised. And yeah, I think that it's like definitely one that both conceptually as well as, again, praxis-wise is really important for me to be continually interrogating, both as somebody myself who's been based amongst different spaces, but is also like deeply colored by my own experiences of being raised in the US with a particular racial politic and analysis, right? So yeah, it was interesting to hear your kind of critique of Isabel Wilkerson's book, because I think that's a critique that's been coming up a lot in Dalit and like caste abolitionist spaces, because of the way that it creates sort of like a facile parallelism between struggles instead of recognizing the complexities and therefore the kind of more authentic ways of building Black and Dalit solidarities, for example. But I think one theory, or like one theorization that's been really kind of calling out to me recently is Jafari Allen's contextualization of the ethnography of an idea. And Allen particularly raises this in There's a Disco Ball Between Us, which explores Black queer politics and nightlife culture. And that's a multi-sided study that takes place actually in like many more cities and localities than my work. But I think what appeals to me about this idea of the ethnography of an idea is that I cannot purport to like be, you know, deeply situated in all three spaces, though I am embedded within social movements in all three. And so I'm really led by the words and the actions of my interlocutors, who are my comrades. And I think they're the ones who are oftentimes interrogating the sort of slippages or easy parallels that come up in transnational praxis, especially with folks outside of the US who are interrogating the like hegemony or cultural imperialism of US racial politics, especially in social media spaces, and are pushing back against that, right? Are like reasserting the history of Black consciousness, or in the UK, the history of political Blackness. So I think at the same time, though, the systems of violence and oppression that folks are organizing against are markedly global, and the folks that I'm organizing with and, you know, thinking through these questions with are identifying those as globalized structures, right, of capitalism, of cis heteropatriarchy. And so I think this like notion of the ethnography of an idea and of multi-sidedness, allowing us to complicate in like meaningful and useful ways the way that we do politics and do scholarship in different spaces, has been like really generative in the conversations that I'm having with my interlocutors about these like transnational juxtapositions. But I think it like doesn't lend itself to an easy sort of like, here's one example that epitomizes everything and is like the microcosm of the argument that I want to make, because things are different throughout. And I think like what this paper, as well as my work in general, is trying to lift up is the way that those things are different. So coming to Noor's question, I think the one on social movements, Noor, that you mentioned, I did briefly note the sort of like contestations around what makes up a social movement in the sort of slide on conceptual somethings. I don't remember what I titled it. And I didn't go very like deeply into that debate in this kind of presentation format because of time, but I think that that's like absolutely something really important that's coming up in my work. And I think that's important also because this research is not limited just to folks who are involved within like traditional leftist social movement formations or trade unionist spaces, but also folks who are engaging in cultural production and cultural organizing as a method of engaging in politics. And I think there I'm drawing pretty deeply from scholars of like cultural theory and performance theory, particularly within queer studies. So kind of relating back to your first question, who are asserting the importance of like the political as embodied acts and as, in some cases, performative acts, and relating that to the way that all social movement struggle is in some cases performance as well, right? Like it's a performance of on the street, we are engaging in political theater that is principled and oriented around shifting systems. But in some ways, that's an act of art or ephemera itself. So I think, for example, Munoz's work has been really helpful for me in that space, or Karim Khubchandani's work on queer dance and nightlife and drag as politics. And I think, so another article that I'm working on that's separate from this is the way that often those nightlife spaces or those art spaces or cultural production spaces actually on-ramp people into more explicit social movements, or vice versa, that folks within the social movement spaces are also going to these cultural production spaces, and that's where they're spending their time outside of the sort of strategizing and more like militant protest or social movement action. So I think for me, recognizing the overlaps between those spaces and the way in which those all form like a multifaceted queer politics is pretty central to the way that I'm thinking about what constitutes social movement or what constitutes activism. But yeah, I think that's super contested and is like something that I'm thinking through with folks. And then I sort of came to the question about queer studies through my answer to that. I think what I'm most interested in is the scholarship from queer folks of color, both in diaspora as well as in the global South, or people of the global majority, who are pushing back against the sort of whiteness, and in many cases the like what they identify as like an abstraction of queer politics or queer theory, of queer theory, and instead grounding very deeply within these particular examples of queer politics that's like lived out and embodied, whether that's in the form of social movement studies or whether that's in the form of, like I just said, nightlife studies or performance or drag or what have you. So I think that work is really like engaging for me, and I think is what I consider to be the most productive kind of venue that queer studies is moving into in the current day, and is deeply guided by the work of folks like Kathy Cohen in the 80s and 90s, or Dua and Sharaga and folks like this, who I'm naming from the US, but also in many contexts, right? Like drawing deeply from the way that Simon and Chloe was theorizing and thinking about queer politics and queer studies as like an intersectional space of struggle. So, and I think those are questions that are coming up with my interlocutors as well, right? Is not only just with queer studies, but the way that queer politics becomes neoliberalized, becomes whitewashed, the way that struggle is co-opted into purely talking about marriage or, the ability to go to a nightclub, which are in some cases important, but are also in many cases like very middle class concerns. And so I think the way that both like the scholars that I'm drawing from, as well as the interlocutors that I'm chatting with, the activists, are pretty militant about the intersectionality of a race and class and gender approach in the way that they explore and experience queerness. Is something that feels like where the interesting work is being done, to use your words. And then I think also that like engages with your question around identity politics in terms of identity politics and class struggle. And yeah, I don't know if I would like pit them against each other in that way. I don't know if that's what you're articulating. Though certainly there's like, traditional Marxist-Leninist or kind of Trotskyite approaches to class struggle where class is the only thing that matters. And there are some interlocutors that I'm talking to who are probably more likely to espouse that particular political orientation towards struggle. And yet, because of their queerness, because of their South Asian or Indianness, in addition to, in most cases, their working class positionalities or their like relationship to working class struggle, they're also thinking pretty actively about the way that those elements of identity shift both the praxis of struggle internally to their movement spaces. So, like the interventions within Feast Must Fall around by the trans collective, or around who gets heard within climate justice spaces in the US, for example, and the co-option of those spaces by like Big Greens, which are largely white-led, het cis, upper middle class led organizations versus indigenous, queer, frontline led struggle on the ground. And so I think that like there's one group that I organized with, which is what that photo came from of the direct action, that talks about the way that they consider identity and the way they consider queer politics to be interlinked with queer struggle as like at the core of their praxis. And so that group is interesting. It's called Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants. I've been a member for about 3-4 years now, because their membership comes from a variety of positionalities with regards to class struggle, right? Like there are some members who are definitely middle or upper middle class and white, and there are some members who are definitely working class and Black and brown. And so even the way that they're thinking about doing the direct actions is something that's sort of interrogating these questions of identity and class struggle, right? So like, is the person on the mic somebody that's directly impacted, or are we doing a direct action where those folks with privilege with regards to migration status or class or race are going to be on the front lines because the sort of retribution and the violence that they'll experience from the state might be less. And so I think like the way that that incorporates both class politics and identity is like something that's really interesting, that's coming out in the way that folks are thinking about solidarity and thinking about direct action. But yeah, I think like that debate is definitely shaping the context of my research and is happening, I would say, in more similar ways across the 3 sites than in different ways. Like I think in each of the 3 sites, we have some folks who are like hard traditional Marxists orienting around class struggle, even though their own personal identities may be different. And then there are some folks that are like advocating a more kind of intersectional way of thinking about politics. And I think those sort of not even tensions, but those generative interactions between those 2 schools are actually more similar in each of the 3 spaces and more different between themselves than they are different between each 3 sites. Yeah, I took a long time to answer. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. I think a lot was unpacked there in that round of questions. So I think we might have a bit more time just for maybe 1 or 2 closing questions and comments, if any. Okay, so maybe I can ask just 1 closing question and we can close it off from there. So yeah, firstly, thank you for the very great presentation. I think you provoked some very interesting conversations along identity politics and activism. Oh, actually, let me also bring in Njogu's question. Njogu is asking, can you say a bit more about your research method and the sites that you pick? So let's deal with that one. And what is the struggles you are following and how do you identify them?
Did you want to also ask your question, Chris, and I can answer them kind of together?
Okay,
or?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the more racial aspect of your discussion, because I think you touched a bit in your conceptual framework on Afro-pessimism, and that's something that I'm also kind of dealing with in my research on colored identities in South Africa, but I won't go too much into that. But yeah, what are your thoughts on what Wilderson has to say about solidarity between the Black community and non-Black people of color? And maybe if you can contextualize that within the whole, conflict that happened last year during the July unrests between Indian and Black communities. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just writing down your question. Yeah, great questions and complex questions. So I'll start with Njogu's question. Yeah, so in terms of like method and how I pick research sites, I think my work has really been guided by perhaps what one could call snowballing, but I think it's like more centered around like intimacy and transnational relationship building than it is really just snowballing. So I tend to both engage in political spaces and interview folks based on the analysis and like articulation of what those spaces are like from folks who I consider comrades and peers. And I think it's important to note there that oftentimes those analyses do not come from people who identify as Indian, South African, or South Asian, British, or American. I think like what's leading me into spaces is relationships across race or cultural or even national communities. So for example, the way that I came into the space LGSM that I just mentioned was because a close comrade of mine in the US was like close with somebody that was a member of that organization in the UK. And really through that process of like queer relationship building that was transnational, that's what led me into becoming a member, and then later kind of engaging in research and conversation about my research with members of that space. And that's been true for my practice in South Africa as well, that a lot of what's led me in has been pre-existing relationships or like, you know, comrades of comrades, that sort of thing. And I think that's really important to note that I'm in no way purporting to be doing like an overarching study of like the full set of queer activism or of South Asian or Indian diasporic struggle or anything like that. Like I very much am studying spaces that would identify themselves as being like quite radical in their politics, quite intersectional, that are like centering queer feminist approaches, though maybe, you know, there's like some spaces that are a bit more like less intersectional, but like more oriented around class struggle. But I think like that method of relationship is something that's coming up for me a lot, and that I'm like working on a paper now about in terms of like transnational relationship as method and as praxis. And then in some cases, like I might do interviews with folks outside of spaces where I'm like active because of the constraints of time and how many spaces I'm able to be present in. And those people are pretty strictly through snowballing. So based on previous interlocutors or based on what other folks have told me, or in some cases, like scans of social media or like digital presence, or like looking at coalitions that are active in specific, mostly urban sites. And yeah, so that's kind of how I come to the sites that I pick. But I think like really foregrounding this politics of like intimacy and kinship is something that's been guiding me in the method. And then I think on your question, Chris, yeah, I want to preface this by saying that like as a person that identifies as Indian, as South Asian American, I feel that there are some debates that are like my space to be in and some debates that are not, right? And so I think that's like a delicate way in which I think about my own positionality and maybe my own praxis of solidarity, even in scholarship as well as in activism. But I think, with regards to like the July unrest, right, or the way in which Afro-pessimism has shifted the way that Black politics is being done at this moment in the US through like the kind of big tent of BLM and M4BL, or in the UK through the big tent of UK BLM, for example, is really important because it's about the way that folks are thinking about solidarity, right? So I think like for my own sense, and also I think for the sense of most of the folks who I'm talking about, there is a belief that like both Afro-pessimism as a whole, as well as like particularly I think Wilderson's pessimism about the possibility of multiracial solidarity is one that folks want to reject. And I think it's a rejection out of hopefulness. It's not like an ideological rejection that's like that analysis is wrong, because I think people see very firmly the, you know, continued violence of anti-Blackness that causes both these ways of doing politics and, you know, these frameworks and scholarship to come up. But I think the sort of politics of hopefulness, of belief in solidarity, of what like Robin D.G. Kelley calls world making is like a core framing in the way that folks are approaching struggle and approaching like Afro-pessimist theory in politics, in that I think there's a hope to kind of show that that doesn't have to be the case, you know, that like the other is not always the Black body, that at any case, anybody who is not Black will inflict violence upon Black communities. And so there was one quote that I went through quite quickly because of time, but it's from an interlocutor who's named Sasha, and Sasha was actually quoting another organization that they organize in kind of close relationship with called DRUM, which is a working class South Asian organizing group in New York. And those two groups talk about something called transformative solidarity, which is like building pretty deeply off of like Robin D.G. Kelley's theorizations of shared struggle or like joint struggle and comradeship, in hoping that like at some places there's the requirement for sacrifice to reject like what Afro-pessimism indicts as the ease with which non-Black people of color can slip into white supremacy, right? So this element of sacrifice is something that's coming up a lot, I think, as sort of like a response to Afro-pessimist politics and theorizations. And with regards to like the July unrest specifically, I think like that element of sacrifice or like putting one's body on the line is something that came up pretty strongly there as well. And also with regards to how South Asians showed up in response to like Black-led uprisings in 2020 in the US and the UK. Very different examples, right? But I think many of the activists that I talked to, particularly those who were based in Durban, as well as in other parts of South Africa, with regards to the July unrest, were articulating the importance of like Indian South African communities exploring some element of sacrifice and the way in which, you know, the continuation of apartheid era struggles have created privilege, and that, you know, the ways in which that privilege can be interrogated and dismantled. I think, however, I did end up talking to like a cadre of folks in Durban who were from a sort of like older mold of organizing themselves, were an older generation than many of the folks that I speak with. And I think adopted more of like a pure class approach, where, you know, their analysis was that what we need to focus on is the way in which like poor Black and Indian people are pitted against each other, and the core analysis needs to be around class. But I think some of the other interlocutors that I spoke with challenged that, and challenged the notion of class being the way out of like racial violence and conflagration, because of, you know, I think the clear presence that class in some cases has seeded conflict, has seeded violence, right? And that also like the experience of like the extreme dispossession of shack dweller communities who are primarily Black, whether South African or other African, is different than the experience of like the working class poor in Chatsworth or Phoenix or Verulam or other, you know, Indian South African areas. And I think folks are lifting that up in a really important way as a challenge to like this pure class analysis that I think misses some of these notions, or in some cases like a politically Black or a Black consciousness analysis that also sometimes kind of doesn't recognize these differences in the way that apartheid continues to, and, you know, post-apartheid continues to create realities for people. Yeah, I don't know what time we end. Are we going to, do we go to 2:30 or to 2? Sorry if I went over.
I think generally, I think the cutoff is 2:15. So, I mean, yeah, we're still pretty good. But yeah, thank you for answering those questions. Definitely, I'll be also looking more into some of those things. And it's some of them also what I've been looking at. But I think that we have covered a wide range of topics and narratives. And perhaps maybe we could end it off there.
Yeah,
so
I just wanted to say one thing, which is that when I am ready to share with you all the physical writing, I think the sort of anecdotal or narrative element of this research is something that's really important to me, and it's unfortunately like pretty difficult to lift up within a kind of like short paper presentation space. But I think like the contextualization within specific stories of activism or of movement work is something that I'm like hoping to lift up in my writing and kind of my fledgling practice of scholarship, as Noor said. So would be excited to share that with you all as that continues to develop. And thanks for
that would be great. I think we all look forward to seeing what comes out of the final product and seeing your name once again. So I just want to thank you for the great presentation, and thanks everyone for your attendance. And yeah, I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks all.